I'd like to thank the committee for holding this hearing. This is a critically important topic, and frankly, Congress is far behind in enshrining some of these protections into federal law. So we've been trying for years to get this across the finish line. I'm hoping that this is the year that, that some of these bills will make it through a markup and get past the House. As most of the people on the committee know, for many years I ran an app developer. And so when I read these bills, I kind of look at them through the lens of, if I was still developing, how difficult would these be for me to comply with, and how would I go about complying with these requirements? And through that lens, unfortunately, the bills that we're considering today have a couple of pretty serious implementational problems. Let's start with age verification, which is key to the protections we're trying to provide here. Because if we're going to say that that an application can't do certain things if a user is a minor, then we have to be able to figure out whether or not the user is a minor. That's really central to the protections we're trying to provide. The problem is, and a couple of the panelists brought it up in your testimony, when you force every single app developer to do that, and the typical user might have 100 apps on their phone, you're collecting private information used to verify that age 100 times, and you're storing it 100 times. And that creates these repositories of private information that are really attractive targets for cyber criminals. So let me just suggest that it's much more efficient and much safer to do that just once at the operating system level. And that means that in the case of an iPhone, Apple would do it. In the case of an Android phone, Google would do it. They have a lot more information than developers do about the users of those platforms. And when you do it that way, you can enforce other protections. For example, if you have an application that's labeled for adults only, the operating system shouldn't even launch it if a minor is the current user of the system. A couple of the bills, talk about this, when an application developer is allowed to rely on the age signal that's being generated by the operating system. And there's been kind of an assertion that there are conditions under which applications shouldn't be able to rely on that signal. And that's crazy, because the developer doesn't know as much as the operating system does. So, let me just assert that if your application is for adults only and the operating system is telling you that if there's an adult using it, you should be able to rely on that. Another thing that I think is really important for us to have a discussion on is this concept of duty of care. And I think it's reasonable that we should impose a duty on the people that are developing and deploying these applications. But I also think that it is lazy legislating for us not to define what we mean when we say duty of care. We had a good example in a hearing in this subcommittee, I believe it was last year, when we were talking about whether or not an application should have a duty to prevent online bullying by taking down a post if it was reported as bullying. And we all could agree, that is reasonable. That's a reasonable requirement. But we're also obligated to say, when we impose that requirement, well, what is the requirement? What's a reasonable amount of time? Is it 2 days? Is it a day? Is it an hour? If we don't define what we mean when we say duty of care, then we are allowing some court in the future to be arguing about what we meant when we crafted the legislation. And let me just assert that it's our responsibility to not put our courts and our judicial system in that place, and define what we mean up front. Enforcement, there's been a couple assertions by the panelists that a private right of action is a good thing. Let me just say, we have to be really cautious about that. There are numerous examples in states across the country where that has gone awry. I'll give you an example from my home state of California. We passed in the state legislature a few years ago something called the Private Attorney General Act that allowed private parties to enforce labor laws. And now if anyone that has a district in California has horror stories about where abusive law firms go after not big businesses, because they can defend themselves, but small businesses. And I could point to multiple businesses in my district that have been driven out of business by frivolous lawsuits that anyone would agree is frivolous. And then one last, and I'm not going to have time for questions because I talk too much, but we're talking about preemption. Here's the deal. We are trying to craft a compromise between being permissive and being protective. If we wanted to completely protect our kids, we would say kids can't go online, right? But we don't want to do that. We want to strike a balance. Once we've struck a balance, why would we allow different states to enact different balances? That creates a barrier to entry that favors large businesses over small businesses. And just think about how difficult it is to comply with potentially 50 different state standards if you are two people in a garage somewhere trying to start a development company. So I'm really happy we're having this conversation, and I think it's critically important we get this balance right, we get something across the finish line this year. Appreciate the discretion, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize Mr. Mullen for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Turning to the Safe Bolts